good. I did do this conference this weekend, and it's about ruled surfaces and other math problems. And so they're kind of fun to draw because they're easy, and they'll make kind of a flowing connection of curves and lines to start to form some space on the page. And maybe we can just jump in. Well, I'll do a couple quick warm-up just to demonstrate what I'll be talking about so it's easier to follow along. But if you have any line or curve, any arbitrary 2 or 3 or 4 of these in space, and you begin to connect them with straight lines between 2 points along them. So they can kind of be anywhere, they can stretch real far, or they can stay very close together, as long as they're just working along 2 curves or lines in space at the same time. And if those continue, you start to develop a continuity of surface and have a flow along there. And these are things that can be made physical, but as a technique for connection, it's a way to kind of produce a flow. And when you start to play with a more open or arbitrary orientation to the lines, they will... Sorry about that. Knock something off my desk. They will extend out and start to cross and wrap around each other and have convergence and opening up. So the basic principle is just to kind of make some marks, either in sequence or just around on the page, and begin to open up into the space of how they're connected with the simple technique of just extending lines between curves and then choosing where to jump for the next extension, and whether or not the same lines connect or new ones come into play. And sometimes that means they overlap each other, twist around. Others get lost in that space of all the points converging. As you pick up the technique, things can go fast, but it also has no end, and so we can take our time and go slow. So if that starts to make some sense as a basic of the technique to follow, you can track along, and we'll just jump into another page and begin to make those first few marks that establish some territory here on the paper. Again, straight lines or curves or something in between can work well. I might start with just some flowing streaks, just pulling a bit like a calligraphy towards me to allow these etches into the page to just give my hand and arm a little space of comfort. You can do quite a few, or just 3 or 4 to start with. And I'm just feeling into how that mark draws towards me. Maybe sometimes with a little bit of a curve to its presence, others a little more straight, depending on that orientation of the body, that connection giving me a chance to go inwards a little bit and think about where my arm might be making these marks. And once you have a few, just picking 2 that are relatively close to each other and beginning to extend one end to the other end. Using these first few to establish our momentum, taking breaths in as we reposition the pencil to the start, and breaths out as we track it to the other curve's finish. Returning again to a line, just a little more than a point, a series of them, tracking through space. As the line comes to its end, repositioning at a new beginning, finding a new connection across this space on the page. Breathing into the start and breathing out across the space. And after the first few, the basics of the technique can drift back from our attention as we just give that breath in, establishing of space on the way out. The spacing between each of these, guided by perhaps the previous iteration, but also free and adaptable to the next situation. Whether that's a clean, straight connection or something that stretches around through the space of the page, maybe even twists and overlaps. As these lines can map some of our internal space outward, do we feel or perhaps feel a need for a state of continuity, of establishing some direction and flow? Or are we in a place where we might need a little freeing up, a little opening of non-direction, as things cross-link, mix and match, compress and expand in local situations? And wherever in that spectrum you might find yourself, the drawing can start to become a reflection or a projection of the internal state you might want to work towards. And if you run out of initial lines, any of the new marks on the page can become the beginning or the connected end of this series of surface rulings. Just a new opportunity to map across a territory and establish some opening. As the density of line might grow and overlap, as you connect and increase the density of your own connection with the positioning of your hand, a pen or a pencil, the heaviness of these more deliberate breaths. We can use that filling of space, the filling of a bit of density, to let go of that deliberateness, perhaps drawing backwards, starting at the end, and drawing towards the beginning. Perhaps breaking some of the drawing's established patterns or rules. Not every line has to fill and connect fully with every other. They could even connect in different rhythms, each one becoming Just that unique span of moments connecting between our in-breaths to our out-breaths. Each one able to adapt to where our breathing transforms over this time of attention through a medium, the attention through the drawing, to where our mind might wander, or to where it can be within this space we're gradually establishing on the page. These flowing, readjusting trajectories, reflections of our breath, and our hands and arms, and the subtle tracking of our eyes between the medium and the page. As we've established a lot of territory there, we can begin to look within it, both internally, potentially between connections we've made before, to allow our hand and eye to go deeper inward through the drawing. If the length of the line and stroke begin to shorten, how does that recalibrate to our breath? Perhaps letting it drop more into a natural rhythm, into the background, as our foreground establishes a consistency of rhythm with the lines along a path. Letting the rise and fall of our breath decouple from the motion of drawing. And trust that our body will keep that regulated as our attention drifts into other spaces here, repositioning, reflowing. Letting ourselves sink into the repetition possible, to let our mindful attention drop into how each stroke is emerging from the space between our mind and the hand, between the pen or pencil and the paper. Is the stroke tracking light or heavy? Is it smooth or rough? In each iteration, is the spacing even or sporadic? Does the stroke feel or emerge on the page differently if I draw toward myself or away? If I draw left or right? Do I begin to notice the slight differences in my own motion and behavior reflected outwards in the motion and visual behavior of the strokes I might be making, tracking along, giving something very small, very subtle for my mind to track into, to exercise that space of mindful attention, within this case our medium of the drawing. And where do these rhythms take your hand through that external interaction, the paper, the pen, the technique, and your hand? Can the rhythms begin to take your mind with them? Into a space of emptiness or openness, where you just become part of each act of marking here on the page. Each act of repositioning, reestablishing calibration of your physical and mental rhythms. And depending on the journey you might take between the first marks or between successive marks around the page, you may find that you reach an end of a territory and can take that opportunity to reposition the body, check in perhaps a little bit with the breath, the posture. Maybe roll the shoulders a little side to side, whether you keep drawing or take a little break from it, and then begin again, somewhere new, to follow a new path through the growing complexity of this territory that's emerging outward from your interaction with the page. I like to let my eyes drift a little out of focus, not quite crossing them to a state of discomfort with the blurriness of vision, but just not quite seeing what I'm looking at. Maybe letting the eyes focus towards the center of the paper, less where the pen and pencil interact with the page, just more of a general overview. Perhaps even allowing them to close as you pick a trajectory and trust the hand to follow it along for a little while. Knowing it'll probably go far beyond or far short of where we intend. And that you can always reopen the eyes, reestablish, and continue on a new path. Or perhaps just start again with the eyes closed and see where it travels on the same path of the technique. These parallel-ish successive lines creating their own surface through space. It's just another layer to the detachment from the outcome of the drawing and an entrance into the drawing as a mindful experience of both a shrinking of the space of our attention that expands some of the space of our creative awareness. Just lets it open up a little bit. And now there should be a pretty strong density merging here. Perhaps some very intense or messy overlaps. Or maybe it's very clean and layered. And as the eyes have been closed or defocused a bit in our motion, a few blinks to them, let them jump around the page a little bit, find points of interest, places where the density on the page might stand out, or where anomalies have taken place, where we found strange new elements while drawing with our eyes defocused. And in that refocusing of the eyes, I begin to see some territory to just have a few minutes of fun drawing into the space we've created, perhaps making some new curves from those blind explorations or fuzzy developments. Hoping to drift around the corners. And just continue the repetition so that our physical awareness can come back into the body. If we've been a little bit in our head or out of our head, it's good to re-arrive with where we are, and the physical action of drawing provides a nice steady platform that engages many of our senses. Sense of touch in our fingers, of somatic or haptic experience in our torso as we breathe and maintain alignment in our core. Our visual sense tracking what comes out from that interaction, and also trying to map the new patterns that we're so necessarily obsessed with to understand what we see. And just spend a little time in this playground, exploring ways you can interact with the landscape that's emerged. Does it look spatial, flat? Can you make some connections with how you might feel internally the kind of twisting, nodding in my drawing, mapping pretty accurately for me to the twisting and nodding sensation in my lower back. And maybe drawing into that space mentally and bringing my breath into that same space. Can I address it with a state of calm and openness from this act of making lines? Maybe open some space for myself to recognize with some gratitude the influence of all things, comfortable or uncomfortable, pleasurable or painful, on forming images or space or expression within our mind that we can reach into with a little practice of awareness, and with perhaps a medium like drawing to let it come out in the space of time and action. For me, this is often much like journaling, being in a space I can reflect, but in a different medium, without words. In the last couple of minutes, as we've reached the end, maybe using some of the long trajectories to just let the arm unwind a little bit if it's been drawing short strokes, and just fill a little bit more space in some of the areas of the page to blend between the different experiments of flow. Take a couple of breaths in and out and keep drawing with those breaths, or reestablish a neutral posture position. And let the hands just relax out a little bit if they've been tense and drawing. Curl a little to their natural form. And gravity press them out a little bit and stretch. You don't always have to press strongly to get some physical extension and relaxation. And have a breath in and release it. And share a moment of gratitude and appreciation for what might have emerged on the page.